Hello, Christian Martinson here again with Dr. James Spencer. We're going to talk a little bit about the topic of land inheritance. This discussion has been formed primarily out of a discussion board at a distance learning class on Old Testament survey here at Moody Bible Institute. So let's just jump right into these questions. So, James, we've got first the issue of land and inheritance. So can you start with describing kind of some of the issues of land and inheritance in the Pentateuch?
Yeah, I think the first thing to really understand is the significance of the land with relation to people in the Old Testament. You know, in our society, there are still some places where land is very important, but for the most part, you know, we buy houses, we sell houses, we build on certain land, we don't build on other land. And really, we don't have a big tie to any particular place or space for the most part. Now, interestingly enough, my wife's father is a farmer, and he's got he's sort of an intergenerational farm. His dad bought it; he inherited a good deal of it, and so there's a lot of sentimentality connected.
Sacred to him.
It is very much sacred to him. And you know, selling that land is something that they're very reticent to do. They don't want to sell it.
Sure.
It's going to be, my wife's going to inherit it, I'm sure, you know, along with her sister, and you know, we'll keep it. And so there is this sense of continuity through time that land represents something more than just ground to us. It represents family. It represents the work that her grandpa and her father did. It holds a lot of memories for my wife.
Yeah.
And so there is this identifying aspect to the land where the land is much more than just where we live. It becomes a symbol for who we are and where we come from.
Yeah.
That's very much a similar dynamic of what you see in the Old Testament. That this land is not just the place where we happen to plop down at the end of the day.
Yeah.
This land is an intergenerational symbol of God's care for us. It provides us with that continuity to show that God is keeping His promises with us, and that God prospers us and gives us what He tells us He's going to give us.
Great. And so what is the connection then between creation and land?
I think there's two issues here. You have to separate between individual ownership of land and then land in general. So with individual ownership of land, you know, you have these rules and regulations related to how Israelites are to care for one another's land. What happens if I have to, you know, sell land in order to get out of debt? Do I ever get that land back? And so there are all those kind of things.
Yeah.
That aspect of it doesn't have a ton to do with creation, although there is an ordering, a concept of ordering there that might be a connection in some way. Land in general, though, and in this case we're talking about the promised land of Canaan, likely does have connections to creation. If we view the creation narrative as a foundation narrative for the nation of Israel, where they're really viewing this as the way that God called humanity to live, what God had given to humanity at that time, which was the entire earth. You know, as the years go by and God eventually whittles down His vehicle for restoring the land to Abraham, the people of Israel, now what you get is the adoption of these sort of creation themes, this destiny to live in the land, the abundance of the land, all those things, and they're more applied now to the promised land. And so the promised land becomes sort of a representation of creation as a whole, with Israel being really a representation of what humanity can achieve or what humanity can attain as they are obedient to God and live according to His wisdom.
Very nice. That makes perfect sense. So then in terms of the hope of inheritance, how does that relate then to creation and fall and so forth?
I mean, when you look at the fall is essentially a loss. It's a big loss. Adam and Eve have it all in the garden. They're empowered to go and fulfill their destiny, to, you know, be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, and subdue it, and to rule over all the fish and all the animals. They're empowered to do this by God. When they sin, what they really choose is to go their own way, to govern themselves, and to not live underneath the Lord. And so what you lose is the surety that it's going to happen, right? The fall is now there's a lack of empowerment. There's a new obstacle that has to be overcome, and humanity can't do that on its own. And so there is an element of hope in the creation and the fall once the land is promised, that God is now definitely going to restore. And look, Israel is his vehicle for restoring what once was in creation. And so there are resonances there. And that's really just one. But the hope for inheritance is that continual reaffirmation that God is with us, God has promised us this, and he will give it to us.
Now, this is maybe kind of a side question related to that, but when you say something of the fall as a loss, now how do we relate that to God and his sovereignty and his ultimate plan and his will and purposes for mankind, and how that relationship with mankind, in essence, does it limit God? That's a natural question.
Yeah.
And his purposes and plans. You want to speak to that a little bit?
I actually think the rebellion of man reveals the limitlessness of God.
Okay.
In this sense, if God is constrained to achieving his goals in one fashion and one fashion only, that's not that exciting. What man's disobedience does, along with many other negative things, is it provides some drama to this story. God now has to look across the landscape and say, I am in authority, I am sovereign. These people are disobeying me. I still want to take them where I wanted to take them in the first place. But now I'm going to have to do things to make that happen. I'm going to have to do new things. I'm going to have to work in them in different ways. I'm going to have to overcome this sin problem that they have. And I don't think that God thought too long about how he was going to solve those problems. I think he doesn't have any issue with solving those problems. It's not like he had to gear up to get it done. He's sovereign. He sees what's happening. He says, I can handle this. So I don't see it as God being limited, and I don't see it as an affront to his sovereignty. What I see is does humanity collaborate with God in his sovereignty? Do we choose to live underneath his authority? Do we choose to recognize it? And in this case, in the fall, no, we didn't.
Now, how about in terms of blessings and curses, particularly those found in Deuteronomy? That is certainly a major topic, and one there's been much debate and things written about. How would you, just in terms of, again, how to even approach that topic and how to look at it biblically? Where do you start from there?
Yeah, I think the blessings and cursings in Deuteronomy have some connection here. Several of the blessings and curses really do relate to the land, whether that is the abundance of agriculture in the land and the fruitfulness that the land will have for the people, whether that's related to rain, whether that's related to security. Are Israel's enemies constantly going to be encroaching on their land and taking it away from them? And ultimately, the final curse, the worst thing that can really happen, is exile, removal from the land. And so what you have in all of this is really a centrality of the land that I think is often missed.
Yeah.
The land is a symbol of God's continued presence with his people. Once the people lose the land in exile, God's presence is still there. It's still asserted. But it is no longer symbolized in their continued presence in the land. The people of Israel, had they just obeyed and followed God's wisdom and lived in the land and been prosperous, that was supposed to testify to God's wisdom amongst the nations. It's in Deuteronomy 4. And so all of these things are kind of wrapped up together in this sort of, as we've talked about in previous lectures, this land, deity, people connection, and how all that worked.
Great. And that essentially answers, I think, kind of some of these discussions we're having related to the land. In the last couple of minutes, I thought it would be fun to kind of talk about this idea of curses and the original curse of the land. that is, broken by the work of Christ,
Yeah.
how are we then to interpret certain things that came in through the curse,
Mm-hmm.
such as working the ground?
Yeah.
It's broken by Christ, and yet some of the effects of the curse are still here.
Yeah.
How do we navigate through that, and how do you even begin to touch on the beginning fulfillment or outworking of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think in terms of what Christ has already done for us, which He has broken the curse. The conquering is already finished, and what we're in is sort of a waiting phase. The back of the enemy has been broken, but the enemy is still in power to some degree. And so the curse is still there. It hasn't been fully lifted. So we do still have to work the ground to get it to produce for us. We're not in yet perfect harmony with our environment and with God because of our continued sin nature. And as long as that peace exists, we'll never have that perfect harmony. At the consummation of the age, I think that all of these things will fall into place. The creation will be restored. Romans 8 and various passages in Revelation talk about this new creation, the new heavens and the new earth, the recreation of the earth. At that time, when we are restored and no longer sinful, and the earth is restored, then I think we will have this really Edenic sort of experience. It will be like Eden.
And how do we then come to the tension, though, with some of that fulfillment starting to take place now? I mean, we see with the launching of the church, the New Testament church and the New Covenant, some pretty remarkable things happening in their midst, and it caused them to essentially start to think that Eden type experience was soon to come in fullness.
Yeah.
And yet we're still living in this tension where there are some breakthroughs without it being. Well, how do we take ourselves away from not just throwing everything into this future time period and not giving ourselves any responsibility to see some of this outworking now because of the work of Christ?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the Holy Spirit is the promise of things to come, and as the Holy Spirit works in our lives, we are going to see this fruit that is in alignment with what's going to fully happen in that new creation. And so as the church, we are to embody as much as possible that Eden-like experience amongst ourselves. And despite the pressures of the world and any sort of persecution or tensions that we may feel, we're supposed to really embody the sort of community that God has in mind. And that's an ethical community that is strong relationally, that cares for one another, that loves one another, and that really follows and responds to God's Spirit.
Yeah.
But what I think we don't have quite yet is that as we respond to God's Spirit in this world, we will meet with difficulty. Because to some degree this world is yet to be redeemed.
Great. Well, that's it for this one. We'll see you on the next discussion board, which will be released soon. Thank you.